So I'm going to tell you a little bit about population growth and namely its regulation. So part of this is going to be redundant, part of it won't be as redundant. I'm just filling in some gaps because we ran out of time and I wanted to elaborate on a few things that we just didn't have time to do. So we're going to look at genetics and the environment and evolution with population size because obviously this is probably important because it drives a whole bunch of evolution and a whole bunch of other issues that we're currently experiencing. So some of these sides are going to be the exact same. So like we're all in exponential growth, or at least humans are. Globally, we turn out to be. Meaning we're following that dn dt equals rn equation that you're going to be dealing with in a bit on a worksheet. And this occurs, exponential growth occurs when we have no limitations seemingly on resources. Resources being food, shelter, and space. So as long as you have food, shelter, and space, exponential growth is possible. Of course, it's not always possible. So once we start to run out of food, shelter, and or space, the population is going to be limited. And we call that limiting area, that limiting section, the carrying capacity. It's kind of like saying for what we have going on, this is the maximum number of organisms we can allow for the time being. Humans, of course, are particularly good at manipulating their environments and manipulating resources. So the result is we have a very big or a very high carrying capacity to the point where I don't know if we know what the carrying capacity turns out to be. When we deal with carrying capacity, it is one of the things that regulates population size because carrying capacity means we have a cap. And we divide all that up into two categories. One of them is density independent, the other one is density dependent. Density independent would be natural disasters. You get no say so if no food shows up because nothing is growing. If there's no food because we're eating it all, that becomes density dependent. But if food isn't growing, that's density independent. If we run out of water because there's a drought, that's density independent. If we run out of water because we drank it all, that becomes density dependent. So it all depends on where or what is the cause of the factor. If it has nothing to do with living things, it's density dependent. If it has nothing to do with living things, it's density independent. Not all populations, however, happen to fall into something that is so simple. That's what we would refer to as the predator-prey cycle. The predator-prey cycle, for the most part, does not exist. This phenomenon of the predator-prey cycle exists in a handful of very unique situations in which you happen to have very limited numbers of predators and very limited numbers of prey, meaning options. So if you happen to be in an area where there's one predator and one prey, it makes this cycle actually very obvious. What makes it so it's not so obvious is if we're dealing with an area where you don't have a food chain, but rather a food web, which means there are options and we won't notice these large shifts. Although with a graph you can magnify anything to exaggerate as you wish. So this graph here turns out to show the predator-prey cycle between a moth and a cactus. And where the predator is the moth and it's eating a cactus. And what you notice is over time, if you have more of the prey, the cactus growing, there'll be more predator, the moth, growing to eat it. The result is we have a lot of moth that will start eating a lot of the cactus. So the cactus numbers go down, and the result is there's a slight delay, and we get a drop in the moth numbers. The moth numbers drop, then the cactus numbers will go up because they can rebound because nothing's eating them, and you get this cycle. Seems simple enough. So when we deal with populations, another aspect that we have to consider is that not everyone in the population gets to reproduce. Those that count are the reproductive ones, and they're the only ones that really mean anything in terms of evolution and in terms of the population size. So saying that there are almost 8 billion people on Earth doesn't mean anything because it's the effective population that turns out to count. This equation here, which has been asked on past AP exams, deals with the number of reproductively capable males and the number of reproductively capable females. This gives us the effective population, meaning this is, in a sense, the real number that we need to deal with. And it deals with those who are capable of reproduction. Where this turns out to haunt us would be in when the population size is under that of an effective population. What you end up getting is an extinction vortex, where you don't have as many organisms, which means we're going to get inbreeding, which is definitely going to cause genetic drift because it's a small population, and we're also going to start to see genetic diseases start to show up. The result, thanks to natural selection, is we won't have as many reproduce, which will make the population smaller, and it starts to spiral lower and lower and lower and lower until eventually the effective population size is not enough to maintain genetic variety, which is basically willing to doom the species to extinction. And there are plenty of examples of humans causing this and not humans causing an extinction vortex to occur. We can start to see whether or not the population is shifting based upon looking at what we call age pyramids, because we can deal with an age pyramid with the distribution of individuals in categories by either percent of population or actual factual numbers. So you get 3 patterns inside of these. If you happen to have the bottom being really heavy and not as many at the top, what this means is there are a lot of young individuals, not as many old ones. This tends to suggest that we're going to actually have what we would call an R strategist approach or exponential growth, because there's lots of reproduction going on, lots of babies, which means these babies eventually are going to start to reproduce, which will result in even more offspring. This is called an R strategist, or what we would say exponential growth. When you look at the age pyramid, and it looks basically level, meaning reproductive age and young, so not those who are past reproductive age, but reproductive age and youth. You get a box shape, what that tends to indicate is we're approaching the carrying capacity. For whatever reason, we're approaching carrying capacity. Approaching carrying capacity means that you become a K strategist, meaning the way that you're going to end up shifting your behavior is going to be because something is making you limit your reproduction. With humans, we have this odd ability to think. Sorry, I'm yawning. I'm still here at school and it's rapidly approaching 6 o'clock. So when you have a population that is boxed and it's becoming a K strategist, you're not going to be just exploiting everything that exists. With humans, since we can think, we might sit there and say, well, we might be doing a whole bunch of harm to the environment, or, oh, I'm not so financially stable, or whatever. And the result is we choose not to reproduce. Whereas if you're in a R strategist, an exponential growth curve, you're not thinking of any of that, or none of that seems to apply. You just reproduce because, hey, we can. If you happen to notice that there are fewer young individuals than there are reproductive age individuals, this is usually a sign of declining growth, for either they've exceeded the carrying capacity or because of some other factor that involves choice. We're having something shift, and the result is negative growth. What makes us odd is when we deal with carrying capacity, part of this deals with us, humans. And when we deal with humans, we can make choices. And we end up following these patterns of either being a K strategist or an R strategist. The catch is we just kind of manipulate it as we go, and it makes it rather entertaining to study. Period.